Dianne was an impressive woman, strong, independent, and loving towards her two daughters. In her world, she was a successful person, juggling a 9-to-5 job, cooking dinner every night, reading bedtime stories, and hosting weekly dinner parties for her neighbors. However, her marriage to Mac was in trouble, with repeated arguments tearing them apart. As a result, Dianne had immersed herself in a social life to avoid being around Mac, who was spending more time at the bar. Every Halloween, Dianne would bake a pumpkin pie, a difficult recipe to master, but she did it with absolute determination. Her pies became a community tradition, an annual treat that couldn't be bought in stores. Dianne always made sure every family got a pie, especially her reclusive next-door neighbor, Mr. Gregory, who found it difficult to navigate life in his old wheelchair. But this year was going to be different. Dianne toiled in the kitchen of their 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, meticulously preparing another masterpiece pie for the record books. Oblivious to the imminent danger lurking behind her, she added the finishing touches to the dish. The ominous presence, patiently stalking its prey, loomed large behind her. But Dianne remained engrossed in her cooking, lost in the delightful mix of ingredients. She only became aware of the towering figure when she turned around. Too late to escape. "Boo!" Dianne shrieked and unleashed a flurry of punches at the man wearing a clown mask who had materialized before her. She struck him repeatedly in the stomach, but her blows had no effect. "Stop! Stop! It's me!" groaned Mac, tearing off the mask and discarding it. "Goodness gracious, you nearly gave me a heart attack," she gasped, as Mac grinned and chuckled to himself. "Gotcha, didn't I?" he teased. "No, you didn't. And you're also late," she snapped, turning back to her pie. Mac threw up his arms in disbelief. "I was just trying to have a little fun. And late for what?" he asked. "Late for picking up our daughters from school," she replied, her frustration apparent. Mac sighed heavily and walked slowly to the front room, grabbed the keys, and left. Dianne smiled to herself. Finally alone, she had finished her pie and was ready to take it over to Mr. Gregory. She grabbed her favorite jacket, which was resting near the door, and placed the pie in a small container. She had bought a handful of these containers for just such occasions. They were cheaper than other options. Mr. Gregory's house was right next door. Dianne and Mac could easily see it from their bedroom window. It was a fine gray house that had surprisingly held up well over the years, even though Mr. Gregory couldn't do any repairs himself due to a lack of funds. Luckily, Dianne always offered to do any necessary work. As Dianne approached the door, she sensed that something was amiss. All the windows of the house were covered by curtains, and the front window revealed that all the lights were off inside. Furthermore, Mr. Gregory's handicapped car was not in its usual spot. Could he have gone out for groceries? Dianne wondered. Despite the signs of absence, she knocked on the door anyway, rapping it 4 times. Finally, she heard a noise from inside. Someone, or something, shuffling around. The lights remained off, but the lock on the door easily slid open. Dianne took a small step back, her heart beating a little faster. The door was never locked. Mr. Gregory always left it open for visitors like herself. She watched as the door handle slowly turned, and the door started to open. Almost too slowly. Dianne saw an unfamiliar hand gripping the handle, and when the door opened all the way, she was shocked to see someone she had never seen before in her life. The person standing before her was not Mr. Gregory. He was a young, handsome man with chiseled features and luscious blonde hair. His eyes were relaxed, and his lips appeared softer than a cloud. Dianne stared at the man with pure lust. He was the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Overwhelmed by attraction and slightly taken aback, Dianne wobbled to the side. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked in a gentle, soft, and kind voice. I'm okay. I'm actually looking for Mr. Gregory." She straightened herself up. The man's brow furrowed. "I hate to break it to you, ma'am, but Mr. Gregory passed away 10 years ago," he revealed. "What? That can't be true," she objected suddenly. The man let out a sigh. "I'm John, his grandson," he introduced himself. "I'm his neighbor and I've been bringing him pies for the past 5 years, Dianne countered. John looked at her with a gentle expression. "Why don't you come inside for some coffee and we can talk about it?" he suggested with a smile. Dianne almost choked with surprise. Coffee with him? It sounded like a dream come true, a true fantasy before her. She nodded confidently. Before long, she found herself waking up in her own bed. What happened? How did she get back to her bedroom? It must have all been a dream. Next to her, the bed was empty, which was odd because Mac always slept in. Thinking of her husband, she remembered that she had to go to work. She must have overslept, she reasoned. Hurriedly, she showered, dressed, and rushed downstairs. However, when she got to the kitchen, she found that there was no food. Dianne sensed that something was terribly amiss. Her intuition was screaming at her as she bolted out of her home onto the street. What she encountered left her mortified. There were clusters of unfamiliar people scattered along the entire length of her street. Each of the two ends was sealed off with a barrier, but not just any barrier. It was a transparent glass wall. On the left side, a group of men in black hoods were relentlessly pounding the glass and screaming incomprehensible gibberish. Their faces remained concealed, and only their ghostly white hands protruded from the ends of their hoods. Dianne swallowed hard. On the opposite end of the street stood a modest bus stop, which was never there before. What kind of place was this? Was she trapped in a surreal dream? Suddenly, a voice from behind her jolted her back to reality. "Dianne, is that you?" It was John. He was real. "Dianne, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. John was still wearing his earlier clothes, but his shirt was now stained with red. Dianne assumed it was something else until he walked closer and tilted his head to the side. "Do you remember what happened?" he asked. "No, what happened?" she replied. I can't say," he said, looking down. Dianne grabbed his shoulders and shook him. "John, what's going on? And what happened to our neighborhood?" "Well," he sighed, "maybe we should walk and talk for a bit." As they strolled down the sidewalk, Dianne and John navigated through the dense crowds of people that littered the street, just like them. Some were panicking, while others were weeping, and some were coming to terms with the new reality. John explained to Dianne that they were on Halfway Street, a short stretch of neighborhood that served as a middle ground between heaven and hell. On one side, there was a barrier that kept the ghouls at bay, and on the other side was the bus stop. Once a month, both barriers would open, and those fortunate enough to make it to the bus would ascend to heaven, while those who were captured by the ghouls would be dragged down to hell. Some people would hide in their homes to avoid the entire ordeal, petrified of being caught. "Tomorrow marks the end of the month," John finally stated. Dianne lowered her head, acknowledging what this meant. She was dead, and her family was no longer with her. Mac was left to care for their daughters on his own. "It's going to take some time," Dianne confessed before heading back to her house. "Dianne!" John's voice boomed across the street, grabbing her attention. She turned around to see him standing proudly in the middle of the road. "Don't worry, we'll make it there together," he assured her. Dianne nodded, feeling reassured by his words. She knew she could do it with John by her side. That night she found it hard to fall asleep. When she did, she was plagued by the same nightmare, a masked man. At first, she thought it was her husband wearing a clown mask, but as the dream continued, she realized it was a different costume. The red mask was covered in dripping blood and was worn by a man wielding a knife. Dianne couldn't shake off the sense of unease. Whose mask was it, and what did it signify? Dianne walked up to the window before dawn and gazed at Mr. Gregory's dilapidated house. As she peered inside, she saw John donning a button-up shirt, and to her horror, a mask was placed on the table. The very same mask that had haunted her dreams. She wondered what it could signify, why John had it, and if she had seen it before. Had they met over coffee, and was that when she had died? Everything was a mystery to her. A crowd had gathered near the bus stop barrier, and John located Dianne promptly, standing next to her with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He beamed at her, and she returned the smile. "John, do you recall how I perished?" she inquired, and John arched an eyebrow. No, I don't," he confessed. "Well then, how did you die?" she pressed, and he rubbed the back of his neck uncertainly. As she spoke out loud, wondering how one could forget something like that, John abruptly walked away without any warning. She was taken aback and couldn't understand what had just happened. They were supposed to be running together, so why did he leave so quickly? It wasn't until she pieced together some clues in her mind that she started to make sense of the situation. Memories of coffee at Mr. Gregory's, a bloody mask, and a large knife flooded her mind. And then suddenly John appeared in front of her again. But this time, he was wearing the mask and holding a menacing blade. Chuckling, John said, "I can't believe you don't remember." It was then that everything clicked for her. "You killed me!" she gasped in realization. John nodded and raised his blade high in the air. He cackled menacingly, brandishing the blade before lunging towards her. Dianne swiftly dodged, causing the knife to slice through the innocent bystanders in front of them, leaving 3 of them bleeding on the ground. The realization hit her that the situation was far more dire than she had initially thought. Lives were at stake, and their fate now lay in the hands of the ruthless ghouls. Dianne pushed her way through the panicked crowd, hoping to outrun her pursuer. However, John persisted in his pursuit, slashing his way through the people with a viciousness that made her blood run cold. Suddenly, a deafening siren blared, sending waves of agony through the entire crowd. Dianne covered her ears, struggling to withstand the unbearable noise. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the siren stopped, and the barriers dropped. Without hesitation, Dianne darted towards the bus stop, where the bus was already waiting. She assumed it had arrived during the chaos of the siren. As she boarded the bus, screams echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. She, along with several others, managed to make it onto the bus and secure a seat. But John wasn't far behind. He too boarded the bus, and the ghouls continued their pursuit of those who struggled to gain entry. John chuckled as he walked down the aisle towards Dianne. She stood up defensively, fists raised. "You won't catch me off guard again, you monster!" she yelled angrily. John twirled his knife playfully. "Oh, I think I will. This time your husband won't be there to stop me," he said, slowly approaching her. Confused, Dianne raised an eyebrow. Then the memories flooded back. Mac had come to her rescue, fighting John and turning his own blade against him. Dianne stood a little taller, realizing that her husband was not the loser she had thought him to be. In a swift move, she kicked John in the groin and pushed him towards the door, where he stumbled down the steps and onto the ground outside the bus. Screaming in horror, he was quickly latched onto by the ghouls as the doors closed. He let out a scream of protest, but Dianne merely smiled and waved as she took a seat on the bus. The engine revved and the vehicle lurched forward. Beside her sat an elderly woman who was diligently knitting. Dianne turned to her and offered a warm smile. "That's a lovely creation. Who's it for?" she asked. "They'll receive it once we return home," the lady replied with a grin. "Home?" Dianne pondered, wondering what the woman meant. Her curiosity was soon satisfied as the bus journeyed into a bright light, and Dianne found herself waking up in Mac's embrace. A team of doctors stood around them, and Mac gazed down at her with tears in his eyes. "You're back, my love," he cried. Dianne beamed with happiness. "I would never leave you, babe,"